As we are all too aware, we live at a time where our society is all too divided, where it is a common practice for people to draw a line in the sand and then decide which way are you going to go, to categorize people, whether they are on our side of the line or on the other side, and then to become all kinds of aggression toward those not on our side. We have this constant kind of volume that surrounds us in battling over the issues of our day. There are many issues where this line in the sand is drawn. Right now, we are raising awareness about the issue of abortion in our opposition to Amendment 4. And as I was looking at the readings that we have for today, what I saw was that there is another kind of dividing line that too often has caused the division. The dividing line that is about something central to who we are as human beings. And it is the line between men and women. In our society, there have been many failures in understanding the proper relationship between men and women, and many voices about, well, what should happen? What is the place of men? What is the place of women? And approaching it according to a separation instead of recognizing a unity. But it is precisely the unity of men and women that is reflected in the very plan of God. The very plan of God that we see from its beginning in the story of creation itself. Today we hear the beautiful plan of God that is the bringing together of men and women. An understanding that comes from God that is crucial if there is going to be a healing of division, a healing of relationships, a restoration of marriage and family and of society itself. In fact, just mentioning the differences between men and women can raise tension for some people, causing people to become defensive immediately and not really willing to listen. And so I want to speak a little bit about what is revealed to us in the story of creation. And if we feel the tension rising, well, let's pause and breathe for a minute and try to listen to what it is that God speaks to us. Now, for some people, the way that the creation of Adam and Eve is described is part of the problem, a source of some of that division, but often it is a misunderstanding of what is revealed in this beautiful story of creation. What we should understand is that the very way that Adam and Eve are brought into existence and the very way that God presents them to each other is meant to capture an equality that is unique in all of creation. The story of creation tells us about God unfolding the reality of the universe itself and the world in which we live. And the crowning part of all of that creation is man and woman in his own image. Only the creation of man and woman reflects the image and likeness of God. And so that creation of human beings is different than all of the rest of creation. But it also describes in greater detail how men and women as distinct from each other were created. Distinct in such a way that they could be brought together with a complementary nature. And so what happens is Adam is created first. And then it tells us in today's passage that the animals were brought to him and he named them all. And what he noticed about all of those animals is that none of them were like him. And his experience of creation with no other part of it that was like him was an experience of loneliness, of a sense that something was missing from what he perceived was meant to be a part of him. And so he said to God, none of these are a suitable partner. And so then it tells us that God created a suitable partner. And so Eve is brought into existence, and immediately he recognizes that this is at last what I have longed for. This is the part of me that was missing. To describe Adam and Eve, created as suitable partners, should highlight for us that Eve was not created in a sense of being a servant, not of being somehow lesser than, but rather in the mind of God, this shared partner, this shared mission that they have for caring for the rest of God's creation. Sometimes translations of the Bible will use the word to describe Eve as a helper. But the word that was originally used in the original language uses the same word that describes God as a helper. When God comes to the response of the needs of his people, it uses the same word to describe Eve as she takes her place in helping all of creation itself. We also see that in the creation of both Adam and Eve, they were breathed life into by God. Adam from the very dust of the earth, and Eve from the bone of Adam. The two of them brought into life for no other reason and no other way than by the breath of God. And so both Adam and Eve, they have this dependence on God for life itself, a shared identity that comes from being sons and daughters of God. And so again, highlighting this equality that we were meant for. It's also interesting in the symbolism of the Old Testament. It captures this notion of equality by the choice of God to create Eve from the rib of Adam. It was not accidental. It was not random that it was the rib. It was truly true. It was chosen intentionally as coming from the very side of Adam, to capture the fact that these two now will walk side by side, that it is the rib that guards the heart, and it is in the moving together that they find their path. And so Adam and Eve are created in such a way that they depend on each other, that they are bound to each other. This is the way that we should look at this fundamental human relationship that we have. Now, part of the reason that people are so quick to draw lines in the sand is that there have been all too many abuses in terms of living out the plan that God has for us. Too many times that instead of looking at the other in terms of this equality, there has been an act of dominance, a looking at the other as somehow providing for me. And so we take a selfish turn as we look at the other instead of recognizing what God has done. Genesis describes an equal value of two types of creatures, dependent on God and meant to be a gift for the other. If we're going to understand who we are as human beings, and if we're going to heal damages that are caused in the broken relationships that mark our life, our history, and our world, we have to recognize the two fundamental truths that come from this description. One is that we are dependent on God because we come from the God who loves us. And two, that we are meant for each other, to look at the other as a gift and to work to be a gift because this is the way that God has designed it. When we fail to recognize God as creator or the other person as a gift, well, then too often we will slip into the kind of abuses that do so much damage in our society and in our families. We have a tendency too often to look at those around us, to look at our place in the world and think, I stand alone. I accomplish whatever it is that I want to accomplish. And God tells us that our value is discovered above all else in the other. discovered in recognizing the relationship that we are made for. And it is recognizing this relationship we are made for that gives our primary identity as Catholics. As Catholics, we are called into communion. Called into communion with the God who made us, called into communion with the people around us. And it is this desire to live from that unity, from the communion that is our unity, that gives us the sacrament of marriage, that gives us new life that we welcome into the family of our home and into the human family. It is this notion of communion that propels us forward to our community to recognize the needs of those around us, to say that there are people who lack certain basic goods, and God compels me to respond to them so that I make a gift of who I am and what I have to another person, all in the recognition that we are made for this communion. And when we live and act for the good of the other, well, then we discover a greater richness in our own life, and we go a long way to healing wounds in our society itself. I mentioned the drawing of lines in the sand that we have a tendency to do. And so the real line in the sand that we should draw is the line between unity and division, the line between integrity and isolation, the line between communion and selfishness. And we should recognize the call from God to stand on the side of unity and integrity and communion. Too many people have been abused by others, and too many have suffered abuse. We get defensive because we want to protect ourselves when we have suffered those losses. But what God asks of us is to let our guard down. Now, Jesus gives us the model of how to do just that. Jesus is God letting his guard down. Jesus is taking on the human reality of weakness itself, but it is also the example of what it means to truly live for the other, to be willing to lay down everything on the cross so that we might live in the communion we were made for, to give his life so that all divisions can be healed, so that separation from our communion with God can be restored. This is the life of Jesus. And so today, as our readings present to us a different image, an image of what God desired from the beginning of creation itself, we pray that the life and example, the suffering and resurrection of Jesus may heal whatever wounds we have experienced in this division, that the life and mercy of Jesus may help us overcome our hesitation to live with and for the other, so that by the very grace that God pours into our lives, into the life of the church, we may truly celebrate who we were made to be, to celebrate the gifts of communion that are reflected in our communities, in our parishes, in our families, in our marriages, so that with this healing touch of Christ, we may recover the sense of who we really are, and that by being a people of faith, we may give witness not only to our belief in God, but to the good of the society around us. We pray that every person may know this healing touch of Christ, and each one of us may do our part to live in a greater communion.